Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and the second part of our double bill today. And the last show, although I may be popping up with some live stuff from the beaches over the next few days as we gear up to the Normandy anniversary, but my last scheduled show until June the 9th. So if you've been catching up on all the old content and need to have some time to catch up on that stuff, now's the time over the next sort of week or so to go back and have a look at the back catalogue of stuff we've been doing. So today we're doing another show about kind of what we can learn moving forward about World War II. As you know, some of my shows are very much here's how a battle panned out from the beginning to the end, and I love doing those shows, but I also like the ones that kind of make you look inward, look at yourselves, look at the future. And my guest today is that kind of author. Marcus Brotherton and I have actually known each other via emails and correspondence and messages for about 15 years or something, but this is the first time I've actually spoken face to face. He was involved in some of the good books about Easy Company, 506, the Buck Compton biography. He's done other work, Gary Sinise, other people. He's done novels as well. But his latest book is about a young man who survived the brutality of some of the worst experience in the Pacific. And I'm delighted to bring him into the studio now. Well, not the guy who survived the experience in the Bataan, the author of the book, Marcus Brotherton, is joining me now. So good morning where you are, Marcus. Good evening. How are you today?
Good, Paul. Great to be here.
So, as I said in the introduction there, you've tackled historical writing from pretty much every aspect. You've done kind of historical fiction, novels, you've done more kind of almost like self-help kind of work, people finding out what they want about themselves. You've done good old non-fiction as well. When you approach the different types of project you do, and biographies, of course, is the writing process completely different, or is there kind of a uniting way you approach all these aspects?
Yeah, I've done, I think it's 2 or 3 novels now, and I've got one coming out about a year from now. But by contrast, 25 nonfiction books, maybe, depending on how you count it, if you count all the collaborations in there. So my emphasis is nonfiction. Why do I sort of cross over from camp to camp? It's because not all readerships cross over. You know, you kind of get some novel guys, they're just like, yeah, I only read fiction and that's all I read. Conversely, you get nonfiction guys who say the same thing about their genre. So big for me is there's an entertainment factor, absolutely, because there's just so many competing mediums these days for people to get their information. And then there's an education factor that's really big. I want people, for instance, who read novels to know about the battles. I want people who read only nonfiction to know about what I'm writing about. So that's really the driving force in both of those.
I mean, in a sense, that you do overlap those things well. In the books of yours I've read, the novel ones, I'm holding up one here, Feast for Thieves. You know, it does explore the historical past, although it is a story of people. And then the non-fiction ones always give you a good idea of who the people are and their motivations and their feelings about things. So you do some non-fiction World War II books are very dry, and they're dry for a reason. They're explaining the operation of a Tiger tank or whatever it be, but you're very much into the human aspect. So we'll bring up the PowerPoint of our subject today, but got to start with how did you discover the hero or subject of this latest book, and you know, was it a story that had been on your radar for a long time, or did it suddenly come at you?
When COVID started, I sat down with a large stack of really obscure World War II manuscripts, because there's kind of nothing I like better, and you know, there's only so much Netflix we can watch, right? So way down in the sort of mid pack, there was a self-published book called Baby of Bataan, independently published. Read through it in one night, and it was the story of Joe Johnson. Fascinating story, grabbed me instantly. Kind of all over the place in terms of where it went, and yet there's this surprising lyricism to it as well. And Joe had actually passed away in 2017 at the age of 91. But his family kept a Facebook page, fairly small, I think 80 or 90 people on there. Located it, reached out to the family just to convey my thanks. Hey, thanks for, you know, boy, your family member is just so terrific. To my surprise, they responded not very long after that, saying, hey, we recognize your name. You've written some books. You know, as the story goes, Joe had independently published this book and sold it out of his garage, sold a couple hundred copies. We would love to get Uncle Joe's story to a broader audience. Would you be interested in researching, rewriting the story taking it out to a broader world. That's how it all started.
It's kind of like the Louis Zamperini thing, because when Unbroken came out, which is a few years ago now, and it was going all the rounds, and someone said to me, "You should read it." I said, "Well, I've actually read his own book. He's self-published or had published by my years earlier." And although the story was pretty good, it wasn't the best book in the world. It's like, I don't need to read it. I know the story, and I was a real late convert to reading Unbroken. And finally, I did. I realized the difference between a story told and a story told well. And a
Mm.
story told well, just it's easier to take on board. It reaches a wider audience, and without being overly praising of you, you do write well, and so it's the ideal person to bring a story like this to a wider audience. So we've got some images you sent, not too many folks. Now we've not got loads to rattle through, but this is our young man, and this story of often when we talk about a World War II story, the hero is young, but in this case, really, really young. So give us a kind of a bare bones version of this incredible subject's early life.
So Joe Johnson, he is living in Memphis, Tennessee. He is 12 years old when this picture was taken, and having a difficult home life. His parents are divorced. His dad is sort of flown the coop. It's before Pearl Harbor at this point. The Great Depression. Food is scarce. Money is scarce. And Joe is the man of the family. Mother is a single mother. There's two younger siblings in the family, and Joe kind of carries the day for this family. So Joe's mother takes up with another guy. He's out of work as well, and Joe finds himself overwhelmed. And he's just like, I got to get out of here. There's a lot of conflict between the live-in stepfather and Joe, and so Joe runs away, jumps on a train when he's only 12 years old. Eventually finds his father in Texas, and then they move to California. There's tension between Joe and his father as well. And essentially, the father gives his ultimatum. Joe is 14 by this point, and the father says, look, you've got a decision to make. You can go somewhere. You can go here. You can go there, but you can't live here. What are you going to do? And Joe says, well, I might just join the army. And it's just kind of a joke to his dad. But that night, Joe steals out of the window, heads down to Pasadena, fibs about his age, and manages to get lost in the shuffle, and suddenly he's in the 31st.
Oh, excuse me. And that we hear about that a lot from people say, "Oh, my great uncle, my grandfather, he joined young." And when you do the research, often it turns out they weren't quite as young as the family legend is. They were young, but not. Excuse me. They're not as young as people think. But in this case, genuinely was underage and genuinely shouldn't really have been there. So what unit does he join, and where does he end up?
Yeah, the 31st, he gets sent to Manila, to the Philippines. This is, again, before Pearl Harbor. In this picture here, Joe is middle row on the left, second over. He's kind of the shorter guy there, second over. He's 15 when this picture is taken. They've just been through boot camp. This unit is actually sent overseas to do boot camp. Strange experience. Joe, he tells the recruiter that he was born back in Memphis. Actually, he was born in Louisiana, which is part of his ruse. So by the time they track down his birth certificate, Joe is long gone. He's into the system. Obviously it's the days before the internet, and paperwork it takes longer to get different places. So Joe's lost in the shuffle, and suddenly he's thrust into this world of grown men, and really needs to cope with all the facets of being in this new world.
And talking about, saying about older men around him in that early war era, so 39, 40 for us Brits and 41 for the Americans, we're talking about lots of National Guard outfits. We're talking about units that have been regular army for several years. So the average age is a little bit higher because these are possibly career soldiers who are there, the professional soldiers there. So, how on earth does a 15-year-old just try and fit in? Did he just try and fit in by being overly tough and acting overly adult? I mean, what was his kind of style for getting involved with these other guys?
Yeah, he kept his head down, kept his nose clean for the most part, although not entirely. He has two older soldiers, his good friends Dale and Ray, who befriend him and kind of take him under their wing. And then Joe's just competent, even as a kid. He's a good worker. He's a hard worker. he shoots expert marksman during boot camp on the rifle range. So he's got a lot of things going for him. He's a smart kid. He's only got a 7th grade education before he had dropped out of school. But the difference between kind of book smart and street smart, he's a smart kid, and he puts all this to good use and blends right in.
Brilliant. And when we get to this area, we know what's looming. When those who are watching this, when we're talking about being overseas in Manila, and we know what's looming. We know we've covered it so many times on World War II TV. The Japanese conquest of the Pacific begins, and one by one, we've talked about Singapore, we've talked about the Philippines here. This whirlwind, this war, this mighty military that no one was kind of anticipating their strength suddenly starts stretching out across the Pacific. So where was Joe when this happened, and how immediate was his thrust into what became the greatest conflict of the 20th century?
10 hours after Pearl Harbor, Imperial Japan attacks the Philippines. Everybody's on high alert. Strangely enough, Joe is working as a bugler at this time and a machine gun loader. And his particular outfit is not really called to the front lines for a week or two. There's the bombings of the naval yards and whatnot. And Joe finds time to get a haircut and play some cards and these type of things. Everyone's on high alert, but as his good friend Ray says, nobody quite knows what to do yet because the Japanese are still coming.
Yeah, and we now know that they're in the early stages. We could talk about it, but we're not going to talk about it with you. There's the unpreparedness. There's the general lack of understanding of how to repel what's happening. I mean, we don't use the word blitzkrieg to describe the Japanese advance, but that's kind of what it was. This use of air power and navy power and thrusting and immediacy there. So, you obviously, folks, people, for the full detail of this story, you want to get Marcus's book, and the description, the link is in the YouTube description below there. So, you're 15 years old at this point. I can't imagine what it is to be that young and facing what's coming at coming at you. So, with explaining the story, but also explaining how do you tell a reader about what this 15-year-old kid was going through, because there's only so many adjectives you can use of terror and fear and what's the process like of trying to explain to a reader 80 years on now what this was like and what it was like, especially for a 15-year-old.
Yeah, very, very soon Joe is put into the battle and into the thick of the battle, and he's ferrying messages from headquarters to the front line and back again. So he knows all the trails of the jungle. He knows where all the snipers are. He's carrying a weapon himself, and it's a situation of kill or be killed. He does get at least 2 confirmed kills that we know of, and so obviously just very difficult time. My wife and I have 3 children, and our middle child, Zach, is 14. And so he's right at that age. My wife read this manuscript and she was in tears, and she said, "Can you imagine our son, in this type of world?" And that's the reality of it. She approached it as a parent, as a mother. I've had other readers say the same thing, that they would read this book and be sort of shocked and in tears and inspired all at the same time. That this young guy would fight as hard as he could. He rolled up his sleeves. He took the responsibility unto himself and just went for it.
I mean, the old cliche is true here. You're going to grow up really, really fast in that situation. Any remnants of a childhood, and as you've explained, he didn't have a particularly good childhood anyway. That's going to go away rapidly when you hear gunfire coming at you out the jungle. And as you said there, he had been trained well. I mean, we can talk about it later, but with the education he had, the one thing he can do is fire and load a machine gun. He's good, he's physically fit. He can do that job there. So I suppose easy for me to say as a lifelong civilian, but you just fall back on your training and what you've been told to do. But we all know that the campaign for the Philippines was fairly swift, with some notable exceptions of some last stands, and we're not going to go through all the different actions here. But in terms of Joe, the bad ending is coming, and it's coming swiftly. So take us through the next stage of the story, please.
Yeah, so there's probably about 20,000 American troops, maybe as many as 80,000 Filipino troops fighting in tandem on the Philippine area and the Bataan Peninsula in particular. We know that April and May 1942 are very key times. April, the peninsula falls, Bataan Peninsula, and then May 1942, it's the island of Corregidor falls. This is the last stand. General Wainwright brings out the white flag, figuratively, although literally as well. And Wainwright did this for a number of reasons. They were out of ammunition. They were getting shellacked. Help from the mainland was not coming. All attention was on the war in Europe, right? And then we're watching Australia kind of at the same time as well. And so Joe lays down his arms, and he becomes one of the many troops, the largest ever American surrender of U.S. troops. Fortunately, he misses the Bataan Death March because he's able to catch a ride to Corregidor kind of at the last minute. He escapes that very horrific part of the battle. But still, eventually it all comes down to surrender. And when they surrendered, they became prisoners of war of Imperial Japan, a country that was, let's face it, not known for its mercy, or known for a very kind of a different style of mercy. And that's part of the story as well.
And important to, I'm glad you mentioned it there, that although the Bataan Death March gets a lot of duly deserved attention, wherever you were, whether you're an Australian in Singapore or Malaya or a Brit somewhere else, or an American on Corregidor, or any other, your experience once you got captured was always pretty awful. I mean, it's various levels and degrees of awful, the Bataan Death March being especially awful, but it was always brutal. It was nearly always horrific. And so, again, you're 15 years old. I mean, I'm thinking the only advantage he's got over some others is that just youthful strength that you have when you're 15 and pushing on 16. You're kind of at not your physical peak, but you're certainly bouncy is a weird way of describing it. But we talk about with the paratroopers in Normandy, how the young guys are surviving the physicality of a parachute jump better than the older guys who are breaking angles because you are 15, 16, 17 years old. So the ordeal there, one can only kind of imagine the horrors. And it has to be said, Marcus, every one of us of our age, we've grown up reading accounts of brutality. So again, with the writing process and trying to give a bit more about how do you try and convey this story in such a way that you're not just repeating the tropes that have been said time and time again. Again, the Joe's youth is the key factor here. But how do you tackle a subject like that people think they know?
Yeah, unfortunately, Joe had left behind a wealth of information. There was also 12 or 13 family members that I could interview, people who knew him well. So Joe had written two different manuscripts. One he had independently published, and one was lost. It was so rare that even the estate didn't have it. I was able to track down that manuscript, and that was a fascinating piece of it because Joe had written one manuscript in first-person voice and the other manuscript in third-person voice. So first person, I did this, I did that. Third person, Joe did this, Joe did that. And the third-person manuscript was the original manuscript. It's as if when Joe sat down to recount his stories, that it was almost too troubling for him to enter into that at first. And as the story goes, friends and family members encouraged him to write in first person. He eventually did that. Joe had also left behind boxes of poems he had written, journals he had written, letters, emails, videos that he had done, fortunately for us. Some of those videos were fairly accomplished, and some of those videos were just very raw. Fortunately, his nephew, Steve Gregg, had just turned a camera on him one afternoon and got several hours of footage. And man, Joe was a crusty character to the end, very raw, and yet I was able just to see him as a person. And I think through the process of empathy, I'm huge on empathy. It's putting yourself in somebody else's shoes, imagining you're that person. What would it be like if you went through that? What kind of emotions would you feel? And I was able to, unfortunately, this era of history is just so well documented that I was able to take all of Joe's story and cross-check it with after-action reports in the military and see that, oh yeah, it did happen just the way he he wrote it down. So.
But the other key aspect that we haven't got to yet is the experience of the civilians, because again, with books that I've read about that, there are some books that talk about the plight of the civilians. I'm thinking particularly about James M. Scott's book Rampage about the Philippines in 1945, all about that. And then there are other books about the POW camp experience or the battle experience. But you bring all those worlds together because Joe had already brought those worlds together. So what Joe has these encounters with Filipino civilians and other people out there. So because when the tagline for your book, you talk about love and redemption. So let's get to that point of the story as well, please.
Yeah, it's a very interesting piece of the story. Right before Pearl Harbor, how to explain this? Joe is hanging out with some older soldiers, and as older soldiers sometimes do, they head off to the brothel, and so they take in tow this young, teenager Joe with them. And at the brothel, Joe meets this young teenage prostitute whose name is Perpetua. And Joe learns that she is actually a year younger than he is. They do consummate the relationship the first time there. And then Joe revisits her more than half a dozen times. And this is the fascinating piece of the story, that he really begins to understand her and understand her plight. She's an orphan herself. Unfortunately, in that day and age, if you were an orphan teenage girl living in the streets of Manila, there just weren't a whole lot of options for you. And so she had found herself at this brothel just because she wanted to keep eating, just the rawest of stories. And so Joe begins to there's one place in the book he talks about, she may have been a teenage prostitute halfway around the world, but she was important. She was important to me. And really, this young girl becomes his only female peer in that part of his life. Joe begins to scheme, how can he get her out of there? He knows it's a very difficult environment. He knows that the brothel is run by this thug named Manny Tang. And Joe devises this scheme using the help of some Filipino civilians to get her out of the brothel, to steal her away. Fortunately, he's able to take her to a convent where she is able to get refuge and sanctuary, and they hide her away. She's actually pregnant by that point. And boy, if you were a pregnant prostitute, life was extremely difficult for you. So he's able to get her to this convent, and then all contact with her is cut off. Joe pays the nuns to watch over her, a little bit out of his monthly salary. And then Pearl Harbor hits and the attack on the Philippines, and they are separated for the duration of the war. I won't tell your viewers exactly how that story ends, but it's fascinating. And their hope in each other and in the love they develop really helps them keep alive, helps them both survive.
Yeah, I'm glad you didn't reveal the ending, because we've got to hold some of the stuff back. But the point is, in those of us that watch, Brad from On This Day in Canadian Military History is watching. He has relatives who fought out in Hong Kong, and those that ended up captives, whether they're Australian, Canadian, British, American, it seems that one of the key aspects to survival is having something to focus on, a reason to live. Now, of course, everybody has families. That's of some kind. They've got friendship, but it seems there needs to be something deeper and perhaps more personal and perhaps unique to you to be that focus. So when you're going through all this amazing archival aspect you got, and you have the different diaries and the first person account and the third person account and the accounts and the videos done by the family, kind of getting to the heart of the motivation of how you stayed alive, that must have been kind of the rewarding and maybe even enjoyable process of the writing, in that you're finding out the reasons behind it, that perhaps if you're a family member, you're maybe too close to the subject to kind of to spot that kind of ongoing thread. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, what kept him alive? He developed this nickname, the cockroach, and it was bestowed upon him. And the whole point was that you can't kill a cockroach. And certainly there's several places along his story where he was just about almost killed in battle, and almost killed in the camps more than once. And yet Joe bounces back. He's got this will to live. He's got this hope of seeing this girl again. And who knows exactly what else it was in there. he still had the hope of life. He did not want to die. He saw people getting killed all around him, and he resolved. He had resolved way back when he was a child, and that's an interesting part of the first bit of the book, that he would never again give in to fear.
Right.
In his childhood, he had this experience where he did give in to fear once, and then came this resolve: never again. That's a fascinating piece of life. There's an application, I think, for all of us today, because so many pieces of life do carry with them fear. Will I take this opportunity? Will I take this new job? Will I move to this new city? If I'm single, will I call up my significant other and ask her out for a date, or the woman I hope to date, or whatever it is? And Joe's example shows that we don't have to give in to fear. We can do the things that we fear the most. Keep going forward. Say yes to good opportunity.
No, definitely. But back to the POW camps. Was his experience from your research typical? Because some people end up in one camp all the way through. Others get moved around. We know with Zamperini, who I mentioned, he had various different movements around there. Did the Japanese, for example, recognize he was younger? Did they single him out for anything? Or was his experience broadly that of other people around him?
Yeah, he wasn't singled out initially for his age. He kept all that secretive. And by then he's growing. He's 16, 17, 18. He's in the camps for a number of years, 3.5 years, really. And so, yes, he has moved around from camp to camp to camp. Other camps are better than others. I mean, they're all horrible, but some are sort of, it's all on a scale. In this picture, Joe is in the back row on the left. He's the second on the left in the back row. He's the guy with the shaved head. This is the horrific Nichols Field detail. And they were staying at the Passé school where they slept, and then they would, every morning and every evening, they would trudge to and fro from the work site. So Joe is in the thick of horror right here, and it's all being dumped upon his head for sure.
Yeah, definitely. And again, we all of those people watching, we've all read various types of harrowing accounts of this experience, and obviously your book goes through this. But again, we'll come on to it later on. The aim of a lot of your books is to have, as you said it yourself a minute ago, this arc of redemption, this journey that people are a better person at the end of a horrific experience than they are going into it. So, again, without giving away too much, I mean, obviously he survives all, we know that already. And this is the photo that I used for the image of the graphic on YouTube, and you can definitely see he has grown up a lot. This is 45, so the war is about to come to an end at this point, a month away from ending, and you can see he's filled out, but there's a lot going on behind the eyes there. And so again, trying to relay this story to a reader 80 years on about what a guy, because he's basically becoming an adult during this process as well as just trying to survive. I mean, he was already, because he was in combat at 15, a young adult, but during this process you're really maturing, and you're seeing every aspect of life. You're seeing around you, you're seeing the best of people, the worst of people. And I know you make a big effort in the book to talk about the medical stuff, because you know when Bataan and Corregidor fell, there were infantrymen captured, and there were corpsmen, and there were engineers, and so these people were worked by the Japanese. So how important was having some kind of medical staff around him to his survival?
Yeah, it saved his life, absolutely. This picture here, right toward the end of the war, he is 6'4", and he weighs just under 110 pounds. Yeah, I think he's 109 at this point. A fascinating story takes place when he's at the Nichols Field detail, and it's gruesome and tragic, and yet it happened. Nichols Field. So we had mentioned how there's sort of different levels of the camps. For a while, he's at Bilibid prison. Bilibid is a relatively good experience in the sense that they're eating twice a day, and they're working, but it's not backbreaking work. And there's a few allied doctors who are still allowed to practice on the prisoners. They don't have much medicine, but they can get the occasional tablet to beat malaria or whatever it is. So Joe is in Bilibid, and then he gets sent to Nichols Field. Nichols Field, by contrast, is the worst of the worst. It's hard labor. The prisoners are tasked with building a runway by hand. So they've got to move this huge hill by pick and shovel and railway car. And by then as well, the Japanese war effort is coming to a crux. And so there's tremendous pressure on the camp commandant and to hurry up, get this airfield built. We've got to land our planes and take off and get those prisoners to work. So the camp commandant is putting a whole bunch of pressure on the guards, and they're putting pressure on the prisoners, and it's just very difficult. Joe is witnessing executions, beheadings. At one point, he gets beaten quite severely. He survives the beating, but he knows at that stage that he's going downhill. By this point, he's very sick. He's got beriberi, he's got scurvy, he's got persistent malaria. He's running a fever every day for months on end. His weight is dropping. He knows he's not going to make it. He's not going to survive Nichols Field. And so he begins to devise this plan. If only he can get sent back to Bilibid prison, maybe he can come in contact with some allied doctors and they can help him there. And so he knows, because he's seen in that particular subculture, the Japanese don't like insanity. If a man has gone insane, boy, they just back right away, and they don't know what to do with this. It's something to be feared in that subculture. So Joe devises this scheme. He one of his limited possessions, he's got this spoon in his canteen kit, and he begins to sharpen this spoon. Every time he goes to the latrine, there's a stone in there. He sharpens it to a razor point. Finally, his big day comes where he's really got to be utterly convincing. And he takes a spoon. He runs into a bunch of Japanese guards, and Joe begins slicing his arms, takes the blood, smears it on his face, and he's yelling out these just nonsensical words, feigning insanity. Well, for the moment, his ruse works. He's hogtied, left in the sun all day long, where the Japanese figure out what to do with him. At day's end, they march him back to the Pasay schoolhouse. Unfortunately, at that point, they put him in what's called an ISO. This is this very tiny coffin-like box, wooden slatted box. A man can't sit, a man can't stand. Joe has to hold this fetal position. He's naked at this point, and he's put in this ISO box for days. And no food, no water. The guards poke him and prod him. I mean, it is the worst of the worst. Joe is not a religious guy at all. Out of desperation, he remembers these words to a Methodist prayer that he learned as a boy. God have mercy on me. That's his only prayer he can get out. And at that point, finally, it starts to rain. The rain actually keeps him alive. He puts his head up to the top of the box and is able to drink some water. Joe gets thrown out of the ISO after 7 days onto the back of a truck. He doesn't know where he's going. By that point, he's delirious. He's in and out of consciousness. He's just about dead. And finally, he comes to, he wakes up, and he sees the face of an American doctor. He has made it back to Bilibid prison.
Wow. I mean, if that doesn't show some, personal strength and initiative and bravery, then I don't know what is. And, we've done some fair few shows on World War II TV about some very, very brave, amazing individuals. Josephine Baker on Friday was one of those uplifting stories. And now we're talking about this guy. But again, he has grown up now, but he's still not out of his teens yet. He's still able to process all this. And so we won't give away all the book there, but the war does come to an end. But after this, of course, you're dealing with a lot. You're dealing with the fact you've missed out a lot of your childhood. You've seen an incredible amount of death. You've seen an incredible amount of suffering around you, things that no human being really should witness. And then you've got to deal with that. And so another aspect you've got to deal with is the fact that he is dealing with whatever we would call it at the time, combat fatigue, PTSD, whatever it would be. And so describe a little bit about the next phase of his life, and without giving too much away, how one deals with just this horror coming to an end.
Yeah, I had worked on Gary Sinise's book, and Gary and I had a number of talks about PTSD, and fascinatingly, Gary does not believe in PTSD. And I stress the D, and it's very careful to follow me through here. Post-traumatic stress disorder. In Gary's world, he says, look, post-traumatic stress absolutely exists. Is it a disorder? No. He said, you take a normal, ordinary person, you put him in a horrific situation, and he's going to have post-traumatic stress. But let's not call it a disorder, because what you're having is a normal reaction to extraordinary, horrific circumstances. So certainly this is what Joe experiences when he comes home, PTSD or PTS, or however you want to describe it. He struggles to hold a job, struggles to hold a marriage, goes through 3 marriages. He's not a very good father to the kids he eventually does have. Self-admittedly, he's not that way. Very angry. He's vengeful. He hates the Japanese. He's still angry at his father for abandoning the family. You name it. He is filled with just this chaos. And it all comes to a point, kind of middle age to later on in life. It comes to a point where his anger gets so bad that he checks himself into a psych ward in California. And Joe describes it pretty well. He says, those doctors, they got a hold of my brain and they straightened my butt out, right? And whatever therapy they were giving him, he responded well to it. And eventually is clear-minded here. He is going forward in life. And that eventually does give him a last good third of his life.
And he had re-enlisted as well. Amazingly, after everything he'd been through, he goes back in, and that's extraordinary. What was the motivation for going back in? I'm assuming part of it is because he's missed out on a lot of education opportunities, and he's dealing with all these issues there. So there are limited choices, and I suppose, weirdly, that's the one comfort he's got, is that there was something he could do back then, which was be a soldier and feel that he was good at it. Is that the rationale for re-enlisting?
Yeah, the family believes that for sure, and it corresponds with Joe's writing as well. It's like, what else did he know? Well, I know how to be a machine gun loader. Now I'm back in the States. What am I going to do? Yeah, so he does re-enlist. He's actually a pretty good baseball player, and so he enlists to play baseball. And then the Korean conflict happens, and they come knocking on his door, and sorry, you got to go back overseas. He's sent to Korea. He's shot in the stomach. Within about half an hour, he gets sent home to where you can heal again.
Wow. And yet, we're going to come to again, the full story focuses in the books, so we can't go through every detail of that, and we need to leave some kind of excitement there. But the other thing, I know we talked at the top of the show about the kind of books you write, and there can be a tendency with books that talk about the Japanese and the experience of the Bataan Death March and POW camps, where you're, without even necessarily you're instilling in the reader rage, hatred, bitterness. And I knowing you from your other works, that I don't think is what you want your reader to feel at the end of it. You want to go through the process. So how do you take a story like this and turn it into a Marcus Brotherton story?
It is about the humanity of a man, for sure. And we talked about this before the show began. Yes, Joe struggles with anger most of his life. And then finally, beginning in the psych ward and on forward, he learns how to forgive, or at least to extend forgiveness. As Joe puts it, I'm not going to carry this burden for the rest of my life. I'm going to set this burden down. And I'm going to do it more than once. I'm going to set this burden down and set it down again and set it down after that. Interesting, in Joe's writings, he never used the derogatory term for Japanese. He was very careful to always use the full expression. And those who know him best at the end said, yeah, Joe is always very articulate and careful in talking about his former enemy. Truly a sense of forgiveness had taken place. Paul, I know you're not a religious guy yourself, and I respect that. Toward the end of Joe's life, he has never been a religious guy himself at all. One day he's 90 years old. He's flipping through TV channels, comes across this TV preacher. And we know that it's Dr. Charles Stanley, who's a fairly sound guy in the Atlanta area. And Joe goes, boy, I've never really made myself right with God or had God be right with me. What do I do? Through that experience, Joe has this 11th hour conversion at age 90. He lives one more year. And again, those who knew him best say that, yes, in that last year of his life, Joe did experience just this tremendous sense of peace, that he had found peace with God. And I think that's a big part of the forgiveness story as well, like Louis Zamperini as well. went through the same experience. So.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I'm not that way inclined myself, but I'm absolutely, if someone who's been through something like that can find peace in whatever it is, whether it's sports or religion or charity work, whatever it is, then it's fine by me if they find some means of getting to that point of resolution. Because there's a British book, The Forgotten Highlander, about a Scotsman who, very similar to Zamperini, his thing was ballroom dancing, and he ended up getting captured, and he went through his life carrying a lot of hatred, but he made sure he raised his children to not bear the hatred that he said. So I can't really get rid of mine. I've tried, but I can't. But don't you carry it forward. And he told them, please travel to the Far East, travel to Japan, travel to those places, and take it on beyond my own feelings. Alistair Urquhart, his name was, in case you're wondering, viewers, who I'm talking about there. And that's that's the thing about finding a means of placing it in your own brain and moving on from it. So, and talking about moving on from things, one of the things I wanted to talk about with you about is this idea and this notion of going through the loss of veterans. Because when you were writing back in the day about Buck Compton and Shifty and Earl McClung and other mutual friends of ours who are Easy Company guys, you did those great books about those men who became famous suddenly because of a TV show, and now they've all pretty much gone. So I had to talk to Charlotte this afternoon on her show about a filmmaker. How do you, as a writer, take forward the explaining of World War II when the veterans and the people who lived through it aren't there to tell it in their own voice? What's the next stage?
Yeah, it's a great question, Paul. During World War II, there were some 16 million Americans who signed up for the service. About 1 million of those actually fought on the front line. You would have the UK stats for that. But it's fascinating because out of that 16 million Americans, there's just about 200,000 left. So it really is that entire generation is passing away. So it is imperative that we record these stories at a breakneck speed, and not only record them, but we surface the ones that need to get told. Yes, this generation is just about past, and then it's incumbent upon the family members, the adult age children, the grandchildren now, sometimes the great grandchildren. If your grandparent, if your father is still alive, yes, sit down and have that conversation. Not everybody wants to talk about it, that's for sure. You've got to win the trust and have a motivation. But really, it's all about how, if we don't study history, we're doomed to repeat it. And I think we all live in that tension today. It's, what we see going on in the Ukraine. It's, war needs to be avoided at all cost. And yet, international bullies can't be let to run wild. And we live in that tension. What do? We have to avoid war at all costs, and yet we can't let, the guy is bombing, children's hospitals. We can't let that happen. We're living in that tension of what to do. Same as the World War II vets.
No, definitely. And that the people you've written about in your career, Joe in this book, and Shifty and Earl and all the other guys, that they were doing something that they didn't really want to do, but they stepped up and they did it. And now, as you said there, we're in a global situation where I don't think all of us will have to face combat again. Although, if you're Ukrainian, you could be called up at the age of 55. So if I was living there at 53, I could feasibly be going out there carrying a rifle, which is a terrifying thought. So I thought I'd live long enough to not be needed, but someone of my age in Ukraine right now is out there fighting for their freedom. So it's a terrible thing to think about. But back to the book, and your aims for it, because I talked to Charlotte this afternoon on the previous show. I have some really hard and crusty World War II buffs watching this show and watching my channel, who are really interested in the nuts and bolts of battles and operations and campaigns and things like that. And I have other people who I equally love, who are very more interested in the humanity and the people and the human spirit. And so, I mean, your books have a bit of everything. But what kind of reader do you think is going to be drawn to it, and what would you like them to get out of it?
Yeah, Joe's story it's a survival story. Absolutely. And I think as we go through our various hardships today, what do we need to survive? What do we need to traverse at very least? Joe had this sense of buoyancy, this sense of optimism, this sense of resolve, never again given to fear. I think that's a huge application for all of us. And then he's just a likable guy. What would I love readers to take from that? You too can get through hard times. Absolutely. You might be in the midst of a very difficult situation right now. It's not the end. There are things beyond this.
No, definitely. And I will let you say anything else you want to say about the book and anything about what your future projects are. But I want to come back to this idea. We've got Normandy is now gearing up to the 78th anniversary of D-Day. We're back to this issue about the fact that there'll be very few veterans here. A big shout out to those who are bringing over veterans. The Best Defense Foundation, Donnie Edwards, my friend and Mag's friend, is bringing over 30 plus veterans arriving on a sponsored flight from Delta. They're arriving in 2 days' time, and they will be veterans here, and there will be British veterans here as well. But we are, as we said earlier, facing that era when there won't be any here, and we will only have the books written about them, and we'll have the video interviews they conducted. So, what will the World War II authors do beyond that era? I mean, Marcus, you've written various things. Obviously, you've written about people from other eras. I mean, when World War II has run its course for you, where will you be moving next in terms of your writing?
Yeah, I hope to stay in World War II as long as possible. And I think there's any number of stories that still need to be surfaced and told or even retold. I have worked in Vietnam. I have worked in Afghanistan in telling those stories as well. And, with World War II, there's kind of a built-in readership. Who doesn't love a good World War II story? And I think as some of the veterans pass away, there are probably new interest in the Vietnam era in Korea. A couple of years ago, I had the amazing privilege of working with Adam Makos on his book Devotion, which is set in Korea. This October, Devotion is going to be out as a movie. So, fantastic. Let's raise all of these eras and study hard and learn from them.
No, definitely. And for those who don't know, Devotion is a Korean. Marcus is a Korean War story, and Adam found this amazing story about a white pilot and a black pilot, and it covers everything from racial disagreement to racial harmony to oppression and prejudice, and yet also has it at its heart this incredible story of friendship. And Adam and you's careers go back a few years, as do mine, Adam's. It's wonderful seeing people like Adam going from being kind of almost a bright-eyed teenager when I first knew him to now this sort of almost veteran writer of bestsellers now. It's amazing how he's moved up the ladder there. And it's all about storytelling. It's all about finding these core stories. So, but I think you said you found this story by going through a set of manuscripts. So clearly you have other things on that. There are other projects on the back burner. There are other ones you found. So we've got a few more coming out before you retire.
Yeah, it's a full pipeline, and I won't tell you just yet what's happening, but it's full pipeline for sure.
No problem at all. But going back to Joe, so just to give this guy his due credit, I mean, the full story is absolutely amazing. 15-year-old kid fighting on the peninsula there in the Philippines, captured, going that nearly dies, and then there's this arc of that you eventually get to this redemption, this forgiveness that you go there. So. Is someone like Joe, does the story in a sense not write itself, but with a story that with that many strokes in it, I'm guessing you don't have to add any drama to the story. All you have to do is just make sense of it. So was it one of the easier books you've written, or one of the tougher ones? What were the, as you in the process of it, what were the kind of the difficult areas with it, if there were any?
There was a strong storyline to begin with, which immediately drew me to the story. This big humanity piece, the love story, definitely all went into the interest. I do a lot of research. In addition, I have 2 research assistants, and they do research for me as well. One of the research assistants had lived in the Philippines, is Filipino himself, so that was just great to have that authenticity factor there. It's entering the emotion of Joe's story. I think as a father was difficult to imagine my own son in that kind of situation. There are hard moments. I had sent the book to Heather Morris, who's actually a novelist. She wrote Tattooist of Auschwitz. And she said she read it in tears herself. And as a parent, she identified with this kid, and she just wanted to kind of love Joe and mother him back to health and wholeness. So yeah, there are difficult places in the book, and there are moments of triumph as well, where you just want to stand up and cheer.
Brilliant. And that's about it's as you said there, it's about making that connection with the reader, because World War II can be told in a dry way. It can come down to this ship is bigger than this ship, and this aircraft flies faster than that aircraft, and those discussions, I join in those discussions myself. But I think ultimately what keeps me going is trying to understand why these people did these things, and how they could do them, and how they could put them behind them when they finished. I think that to me is the question that you have done your best at asking in the books We Who Are Alive and Remain, and the Company of Heroes, and those guys, that you talk to them not only about what they did then, but also how they dealt with it, and explaining how Joe's 50, 60-year process of coming to terms with this is just as important as the actual wartime experience itself. Because if you'd ended it in 1945 saying he came back home, it wouldn't have worked. It doesn't have that end to the story, and I'm glad you carried it that way. So yeah, brilliant talking to you, Marcus. And it is out now to order. It's out in all your good available good bookstops and libraries and on internet sellers, and the links in the description below. So anything else you want to say as we're leading up to the 70th anniversary? Anything you want to say to the World War II viewers about remembrance or commemoration, or writing about World War II? Any final thoughts?
Well, I would love to put in a good word for you. Probably not that your viewers need it, but I will say that I have about half a dozen people on rotation. When I'm stumped on a question concerning World War II, who do I call? I call up Paul, and Paul delivers. And I appreciate your big heart in that area. You've come through several times in the past. It's just great. So thank you very
Well,
much.
thank you very much. It's nice to know. I'm appreciated. I'm glad we finally got this chance to chat. So I'm just going to take you off screen for a second and come back and talk to you in a minute. So, folks, as I said at the beginning, that's it. That's me done until June the 9th. We've got some great shows coming your way after D-Day. We've got Steve Zaloga doing his second part about Pointe du Hoc. Joanne McDonald is talking about the men of Pointe du Hoc. We've got a midway show coming your way. I'm working on our Animals at War week. That's going to be amazing. Some great stories: pigeons, horses, dogs, and the famous bear in the Polish military. We're covering that. New Zealand at War is coming up. So as usual, don't forget to subscribe. Don't forget to share what we're doing on social media. Consider becoming a patron. Consider becoming a YouTube member. Views did start dropping for all the podcasts and YouTube channels about the time of the war beginning in Ukraine, and we understand that, but things are picking up again now. So thank you for all your support. And I may just pop up here and there over the anniversary of D-Day with some live streaming from the beaches, or interviewing. If I bump into a historian I know, I might do something like that, but we'll see. But the next scheduled shows are June the 9th. But I'm going to bring Marcus back in just to say thanks very much and chatting for you. It's still lunchtime where you are. I'm going to go and have a drink, but it's lunchtime for you. So thank you very much for taking time out of your schedule. Good luck with the book. You don't need my luck. You've got, as you said, you've got 25 best-selling titles out there behind you. You've been on the tops of the charts with the Reds. You don't need my praise, but I will say it anyway. Good luck with the book, and good luck with your future projects.
Thank you, Paul.
Brilliant. So that's it then. It's Paul Woodhead for World War II TV. I will see you after the anniversary. Cheers, everybody. Thanks for watching. Bye.